Hey everybody, welcome back. So in this third video for this module, we're going to be wrapping up our line chart app, our Fred line chart app, and we're specifically be working on the server function for this app. And what we're going to be focusing on are these two reactive functions that are going to dynamically update our plot based on two types of user input, the drop-down menu and the slider that the user is going to manipulate to look at different periods of time, different intervals in the data. Okay, hopefully that makes sense and you've been following along. If not, it will in a second, so let's go ahead and dive in. So we'll say define the server function, and here we want to create an object called server, of course, and then function input output, and we're not going to worry about the session argument because we're not going to use it here. For the server function we use the brackets. Okay, let's give ourselves a little bit of space down there. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to use a reactive function to dynamically query the Fred API to download the data for the indicator selected by the user. Okay, so we'll download data from Fred with a reactive function, and we'll say this only updates when the user selects a new indicator. Okay, and so we're going to store our data for whatever selected indicator in an object called Fred underscore indicator. We'll call reactive here, and because this is a reactive function, we need both the parentheses and the brackets, you know, just like we had with render plot the last time. So we're calling reactive, and then we're going to use the Fred R function to query the Fred database. And so we're embedding that now in a reactive function so that we'll query the database each time a user selects a new indicator. So that's pretty cool, I think. So series underscore ID equals, so we have these arguments that are standard for the Fred R function. So we need to say what the series ID is, and for this we're going to use our input, our indicator input, right, from the user. So series ID is going to be input $sign indicator. All right, and then comma. All right, next argument is, or the next two arguments are observation start and observation end. So what is the period for which we want to pull these data from the Fred database? So observation start underscore start equals start date, right? Remember that? That's the what we defined up here in the setup part when we defined start date as January 1st, 1970, and end date as our system date. So observation start equals start date, observation underscore end equals end date. Okay, and that is our first reactive function. Okay, that is going to update this object here with this query based on to the Fred database based on the user input. So that's number one. Okay, second one is we want to filter the data according to the selected years, right? Whatever years the user has selected, and we're going to say this only updates when user selects a new date range. All right, and so here we'll say we're just going to store this as Fred data, and this is ultimately the object that we're going to be using in our ggplot call below. So we'll call this Fred data, and this is going to be a reactive function. So parentheses and brackets. All right, and here we want to say, we want to reference this up here, Fred indicator. Okay, whatever the data is that the user selected, so we're going to say Fred underscore indicator. And this is important actually because because we are referencing data that is from a reactive function. Okay, we need these parentheses. This is to ensure that the reactive expression is evaluated and that its current value is used as the input for the plot. Okay, so if you just put Fred underscore indicator without the parentheses, it's not going to give you, it's not going to work. You need to, we're referencing, again, these are data from a reactive function, so we need to have these parentheses after Fred underscore indicator if we want it to work properly. Similarly, when we're doing our ggplot call below, we're going to have to reference Fred underscore data with parentheses after the data. All right. Okay, so an important little tidbit there. So then what we're going to do is we're going to take those data that are stored in this object here that the user has selected, and we're going to filter them. All right. And we're going to use a between function from dplyr to filter them. So we're going to say between, and we're using date here. So date is coming actually from the, if you look in the downloaded data, there is a column called date, right? That is downloaded, you know, along with the indicator that we're downloading. And if you wanted to test that and see what that looks like, you could just take Fred R, this function here, and you could start a new R script. And you could just load Fred R, and you could, you know, define the start date and the end date, and then define the series ID yourself, or you just input the series ID here, call Fred R, and save these data as an object, and then look at that object. And then you will see that there is a date column, and then there's the indicator, the data for the indicator, okay? But we want to filter based on that date column that's in there, all right? So filter between date, all right? And we're going to use the user input for from the slider here, which we've referred to, we said we're going to refer to as range, all right? And there's going to be two values for range. The one is going to be the start, two is going to be the finish of this range, all right? So we're going to put input $range, and we're going to subset it with the number 1. And then we're going to have input $range, and we're going to subset that with number 2. So we're going from whatever the user has selected from as the first value to what they've selected as the second value, or first date and second date. All right. So those are our two reactive functions. And now from here, what we can do is we can render our line chart. All right, and this is going to be our output that we're going to display up here in the UI, right? Our plot output. And we're going to call that line chart, or we already said we're going to call it line chart up here in the, when we built the UI, right? Line chart. And then we're going to use a render plot. And render plot is going to be listening for this reactive data. Okay, and then from there we are going to build plot with ggplot2. All right, and this part is going to look very familiar to you because we worked so much with ggplot2 in this class. So we're going to call it ggplot. And we're going to be using, again, our Fred data here, and we're going to have these parentheses after it because, again, these are coming from a reactive function, right? So we want to make sure that the most updated, that reactive function is evaluated and that the most updated data are being used. All right, then AES, our aesthetics, is going to be x equals date, and then y equals value. All right, and then we're going to have a line chart, so geom_line, and let's color it navy blue. You can choose another color if you want. And then we're going to have some labels. So again, as with our last plot, these are going to dynamically change. We're going to leave x-axis blank because I think it's obvious what's going on there because we have just a date. And then with the y-axis, we do need to label. So we're going to do what we did in the last with the last app. And we're going to use the names function to pull the name from our list of variables. And then we're going to use the which function to subset that list of variables and basically use the index number to identify the name of the variable in that list. So names, which vars equals input indicator. So we're taking the user input here. I explained this in the last video in a pretty detailed way, but again, we're going to be based on whatever the user input is for the indicator. We're going to be using the which function to identify the index number of that indicator, and then using that to call the name. We're going to subset the variables list based on that number and then pull the name from that item, right? That item in the list. All right. Okay, so that takes care of the labels. And let's have a minimal theme. So theme_minimal. And then we will do, we'll add our recession shading. The last part of this is to add the recession shading. Remember, that's the helper function that we had loaded earlier. All right, and for this, we are going to use the function which is in that helper code, that helper.r file. So if you open that up, you'll see it builds a function called add_rec_shade, and then our arguments are start date, and our start date is going to be dynamically determined by the user through the range input. So input range 1, and then our end date is going to be input range 2. And our shade color, let's make that gray. That's the standard. We'll make it dark gray. And then we also have to define the Y-min and the Y-max because we don't want our recession shading to be bigger than, you know, the plot area, or, you know, stretching out the plot, or being too small relative to what's being plotted. So we have to dynamically change this as well. So we'll call min, and we'll use our Fred data again, right, which is the dynamically created data up here from our reactive function. So we're going to take the min value from that indicator, essentially, and that's going to define the bottom of the recession rectangles, and then the max value from that indicator is going to define the top of the max value for the recession rectangle. Hopefully that makes sense. So value, and then we're going to do y, same thing for the max value. So equals max Fred_data, and then parentheses, and then value. All right, and that should be it. Okay, so should be good to go here. Let's go ahead and call call the app, but before we do that, I noticed one error up here. Instead of calling filter in our first reactive function, I called flitter. So let's go ahead and change that to filter. We'll go ahead and save it. Everything else looks good. Let's call shiny app, UI equals UI, server equals server. All right. And let's run the app and see if it works. And here we go. We have some consumer confidence data that has been plotted along with our recession shading in the background. We can test this input here. Let's select a different indicator. We'll select business confidence. Try a composite indicator. We can test a different time series. So let's just do the 1980s or something like that. That looks good. Let's try unemployment rate. Try a different time series. Try the growth rate. Try a different time series. And yes, it looks like everything is working properly. So that brings us to the conclusion of this little mini project here. And now you should have a pretty good understanding of how a reactivity works and how to incorporate multiple reactive elements into your Shiny app.